A body slammed into a wall hard enough to crack the plaster. A woman's scream cut through the rain. A big hand closed around her throat and squeezed. Her feet came off the floor. She clawed at his wrist, but the man just leaned in harder. Down the hall, a mop handle stopped moving. A woman in a gray uniform stood frozen at the top of the stairs, listening. She heard the wet sound of a fist landing on soft flesh. She heard a pregnant woman beg for her life. And Delia Prenti, who had spent 30 years learning to keep her head down and mind her own business, made a choice she could never take back. She set down her bucket. She picked up an iron poker from the fireplace. What one poor maid did next would bring 40 men to her door. Stay with me on this one. Now let me back up a little, because you need to understand who this woman was before that night. Delia Vasquez cleaned the Prentice boarding house 6 days a week. She was 51 years old. She was maybe 5'2" in shoes. She weighed nothing. She had hands that cracked at the knuckles from bleach and hot water, and she wrapped them in tape every morning like a boxer who'd never thrown a punch in her life. She worked for the Prentice family. Old Sacramento money. The kind of people who owned a big 3-story house near the river and rented out the good rooms to people who could afford them. Delia scrubbed their floors. She washed their sheets. She emptied their trash and never once looked in it. That was the job: be invisible, see nothing, say nothing. And she was good at it, believe me. She had learned to be invisible a long time ago. She didn't talk much about her own life, but here's the part that matters. Delia had been married once, 20 years, to a man who came home angry more nights than not. She knew the sound of a fist before it landed. She knew the way a house goes quiet right before it gets loud. She had spent 2 decades reading a man's footsteps in the dark, trying to guess which husband was walking through the door tonight. She had buried that marriage and moved to a 1-room apartment across town, and she had promised herself she was done with all of it. So when the Prentice family took in a new tenant that spring, Delia barely noticed him at first. His name was Marcus Prentice, the nephew. Tall, expensive haircut, the kind of smile that never made it up to his eyes. He'd married a younger woman and brought her to stay in the guest wing while he got back on his feet, whatever that meant. The wife was quiet, pretty, and when Delia met her, she was 6 months pregnant, one hand always resting on her belly like she was holding something together. Her name was Colette. Now Delia didn't know a single thing about Colette, didn't know her last name, didn't know her people. To Delia, she was just a soft-spoken young woman who said thank you when nobody else did, who once brought Delia a cup of coffee when she was mopping the stairs and stayed to talk for 10 minutes like they were equals. That never happened in that house. The rich people didn't see the help. Colette saw her. Here's the thing about Colette, though, and she didn't advertise it. She came from a very different world than the Prentice family. Her older brother ran a motorcycle club, not a hobby club. The real thing. Hell's Angels, a chapter president out of the valley, a man everyone called Boone. Colette had walked away from all of that. She'd wanted something soft and normal and safe. So she'd married a clean-cut rich boy named Marcus and never told his family where she came from. She thought she was climbing up in the world. She had no idea she'd married something worse than anything her brother ran with. Because Marcus hit her. Delia figured it out the way she always figured these things out. A bruise on Colette's arm that didn't match a story about a kitchen cabinet. The way Colette flinched when a door closed too hard. The way she went silent and small whenever Marcus walked into the room. Delia had lived that exact life. She recognized it in Colette like looking in a mirror 20 years back, and it ate at her. It ate at her every single day. She wanted to say something. She almost did, a dozen times. There was one afternoon she got close. Colette was sitting alone in the kitchen with a cup of tea she wasn't drinking, and there was a fresh mark under her jaw she'd tried to cover with makeup. Delia opened her mouth. She had the words right there, And then she heard Marcus's car in the drive, and she picked her rag back up and wiped a counter that was already clean, and she said nothing at all. She hated herself for that. She lay awake thinking about it, but she was the maid. She had one job, and that job was to see nothing. If she opened her mouth, she'd be gone by Friday, and then who'd pay her rent? Who'd cover her medicine? A woman like Delia didn't get to be a hero. A woman like Delia kept her head down and prayed for somebody else to notice. Nobody else noticed. That was the problem. Everybody in that house looked right past Colette Reyes. Everybody except the maid. The rain came in hard that night. One of those spring storms that turns the river brown and knocks the power flickering. The family was out. Old Mr. Prentice and his wife had gone to some charity dinner downtown, and the staff had all clocked out at 6. Everybody but Delia. She'd stayed late to finish the third-floor bathrooms because she needed the extra hours and nobody was going to give them to her for free. So it was just the 3 of them in that big house. Delia up on the stairs with her bucket, and down in the guest wing Marcus and his pregnant wife, and her dog, because Colette had a dog, an old German shepherd named Diesel, gray around the muzzle, stiff in the hips, 13 years old if he was a day. That dog had been Colette's since before the marriage, since her old life, and Marcus hated him, called him a flea bag, threatened to have him put down twice. But Colette wouldn't let go of that dog, and Diesel wouldn't leave her side, and the 2 of them understood something about each other that nobody else in that house did. That's the setup. That's where we were when the screaming started, and once it started, everything happened fast. It began as an argument. Delia heard the voices climb through the floor. She'd learned to tune it out the way you learn to sleep next to a highway. But then she heard a sound that wasn't an argument anymore. A thud, the wet crack of a body meeting a wall, and then Colette screaming, and it wasn't anger in that scream. It was fear, pure animal fear. Delia stood up on the stairs with her heart hammering. Every instinct she'd built over 50 years told her the same thing. Don't. Stay out of it. It's not your business. You'll lose everything. She thought about her rent. She thought about her medicine. She thought about being 51 and starting over with nothing, and how nobody would hire her once the Prentice name said she was trouble. Then she heard Colette say one word through the wall. She said, "The baby." She said it like a prayer. She said it like a woman trying to protect something that couldn't protect itself, and something in Delia broke loose. She came down those stairs fast for a small woman. She grabbed the iron poker off the rack by the front fireplace on her way past, cold and heavy in her taped-up hands. She followed the noise to the guest wing, and she pushed open the door. What she saw stopped her cold for half a second. Marcus had Colette pinned against the wall by her throat. Her feet were barely touching the floor. Her face was going the wrong color. And she was pregnant, hugely pregnant. One hand still wrapped around her belly even now, even here, trying to keep her baby safe while a man choked the life out of her. The old dog, Diesel, was going insane. Snapping, barking, but every time he lunged, Marcus kicked him back, and the dog was 13 and slow, and he kept coming anyway, kept putting himself between the man and his person. Delia didn't think. She told me later she didn't remember deciding anything. She just raised that poker and swung it across Marcus Prentice's back with everything her little body had. He roared. He dropped Colette, who slid down the wall gasping, and he spun around, and for the first time Marcus Prentice actually looked at the maid. Saw her. This tiny woman in a gray uniform holding a fireplace poker in 2 shaking hands. He laughed. He actually laughed. "You," he said, "you're going to hit me." And he came at her. Now Delia was small, and in that half-second she knew it. She saw the size of him, and she knew that if he got his hands on her, she was finished. But Diesel wasn't done. As Marcus lunged, that old dog found one last piece of the animal he used to be and clamped his jaws down on Marcus's leg. Marcus screamed and stumbled, and in that half-second Delia grabbed Colette by the arm and hauled her up off the floor. "Come on," she said. Come on, honey, we go now. She got Colette moving. She got the dog to let go and follow. She dragged all of them down the hall, out the front door, into the rain, while Marcus roared behind them and clutched his bleeding leg. She could hear him screaming that he'd find them, that she was dead, that he'd end her. She didn't stop. She shoved Colette into her old rusted sedan. She put the dog in the back. She got behind the wheel with hands shaking so bad she could barely turn the key. It took her 3 tries while a bleeding man staggered toward the porch behind them. And she drove. She drove across town in the pouring rain with a beaten pregnant stranger and a bleeding old dog, and she did not once look back at the house or the job or the life she'd just thrown away. She drove to the only safe place she knew, her own tiny apartment, 2 rooms and a hot plate on the wrong side of Sacramento. She got Colette up the stairs and inside. She locked the door. She put a chair against it, which was stupid, and she knew it was stupid, but she did it anyway. And then, for the first time in an hour, the world went quiet. The rain drummed on the window. Colette sat on the edge of Delia's bed, shaking, holding her belly, whispering that the baby was still moving. Thank God the baby was still moving. Delia made tea because that was the only thing she knew how to do with her hands when she was scared. She cleaned the cut over Colette's eye. She wrapped a bag of frozen peas in a towel and pressed it to the girl's throat. And Diesel, old and gray and bleeding a little himself, walked one slow circle around that little apartment. Then he lay down across the doorway with his head up and his ears forward, facing the door, and he did not close his eyes. It was over. That's what it felt like. They were safe. They'd gotten out. Delia sat down in her one good chair with a cup of tea going cold in her hands, and she let herself breathe for the first time all night. She looked at this girl and this dog in her tiny home, and she thought, we made it. Whatever this costs me, we made it. She was already doing the math on the ruin of her own life, and she found she didn't care. For the first time in 20 years, she felt like she'd done the right thing. She had no idea what was coming. None of them did, because somewhere across town, a phone was ringing. Colette had made a call from Delia's kitchen, just one. She'd asked to borrow the phone, and she'd stepped to the corner and she'd spoken low and fast, and Delia hadn't listened because it wasn't her business. She figured the girl was calling family, and she was. That was exactly what she was doing. Around 2 in the morning, headlights slid across the apartment wall, then more, then more. Delia went to the window and looked down at the street, and what she saw made her stomach drop. Motorcycles. A whole line of them, rolling slow and low through the rain, one after another, filling up the little dead-end street below her building. The engines shook the glass in her window frame. 10 of them, 20, more coming. Big men in leather with patches on their backs, cutting their engines, stepping off, looking up at her building. At her window, and leading them, a huge man with a gray beard climbed off the first bike and stood in the middle of the street in the rain and looked straight up at Delia Vasquez like he knew exactly which window she was standing behind. Colette came up beside her at the glass. She saw the men below, and instead of screaming, instead of running, she started to cry, but not the way you'd think. "That's my brother," Colette whispered. "That's Boone, Delia. That man down there is my brother." Delia's blood went to ice. She understood 2 things in the same instant. 1, the quiet girl she'd saved was not who she thought she was. And 2, 40 of the most dangerous men in California were standing outside her door, and every single one of them was about to learn the name of the person who'd put their president's pregnant sister in a stranger's apartment. She didn't know yet if that made her safe or dead. If you've made it this far with me, do me one favor. Hit that subscribe button, because what these 40 men did next is the whole reason I'm telling you this story, and you are going to want to see how it ends. Delia went down the stairs on legs that didn't want to hold her. She could have stayed up in that apartment, but she thought, if there's going to be trouble, it's not going to happen up there with Colette and the baby. So she went down, alone. A 51-year-old maid in a bathrobe walking out into a street full of Hell's Angels at 2 in the morning. The rain had softened to a drizzle. The men parted for her. Nobody said a word. She walked out to the middle of the street where the big man with the gray beard stood waiting, and she stopped in front of him, and she had to tip her head all the way back just to look at his face. Boone Reyes looked down at her for a long time. This mountain of a man. Scarred knuckles, tired eyes, 40 riders at his back, and this tiny woman standing in front of him with wet hair and taped-up hands. "Eudelia," he said. His voice was quiet, lower than she expected. "Yes," she said, her voice shook. "Your sister is upstairs. She is safe. The baby is okay. I promise you the baby is okay." Something moved across the big man's face. He looked away for a second, out at the rain, and when he looked back his jaw was working like he was chewing on something hard. "My sister called me an hour ago," Boone said. "First time I heard her voice in 2 years. She cut me off when she married that man, said she wanted a clean life, said she was done with all of this." He gestured at the bikes, at the men, at himself. "And tonight she calls me and she can barely talk because her throat's so bruised, and she tells me a maid I never met, a woman who works for the family that let this happen, that's who came through the door with a fire poker." He stopped. "You know what that man is. You know what he did to her." "I know," Delia said quietly. "I know exactly what he is. I was married to one for 20 years. And that landed. You could see it land." Boone Reyes looked at this little woman like he was seeing her for the first time. All around them, 40 men stood silent in the rain, and every one of them had heard it. Nobody moved. Somewhere down the line, one of them took off his cap. "Why?" Boone said. "You could have lost that job, probably did. You didn't know her, you didn't know me. Why'd you do it?" Delia thought about that for a second, and then she gave him the truest answer she had. "Because nobody did it for me," she said. "For 20 years. Nobody came. Every neighbor heard it through the walls and turned up their television. Every friend looked the other way. I promised myself if I ever saw it happen to somebody else, I would not walk by. That's all. I'm not brave. I just couldn't walk by." Nobody said anything. The rain came down soft on 40 leather jackets. Then Boone Reyes did something that made his whole club go still. He got down. This enormous man lowered himself onto one knee in the wet street so his eyes were level with hers, and he took one of her small taped-up hands in both of his enormous scarred ones, gentle as anything, like he was holding a bird. "Delia," he said, "you saved my blood. You saved my sister, and you saved a baby that's not even born yet. There's no man in this club, there's no man in this world that means more to me than that. So I need you to listen to me now. From tonight, you are not alone anymore. You understand? You have 40 brothers. You have me. Anybody ever raises a hand to you again, they answer to all of us." Delia started to cry. She couldn't help it. 51 years old, and nobody had ever said anything like that to her in her whole life. But the night wasn't over, because Marcus Prentice wasn't done either. Around 3 in the morning, a car came screeching onto the street. Marcus. Drunk, furious, his leg bandaged where the dog had bitten him, and he had a pistol. He'd called the Prentice family lawyer and the police, and he was screaming about kidnapping, about theft, about how the maid had stolen his wife and his property, and how he was going to have every one of these men arrested and this old woman thrown in prison. He came out of that car waving a gun, and 40 men went very, very still. Here's where it could have gone wrong. Here's where you'd expect it to turn into a bloodbath. And I'll be honest with you, for 1 second it almost did. Hands moved toward jackets. You could feel it in the air, the way a room feels right before glass breaks. Boone stood up slow off his knee and turned around, and there was something in his face now that hadn't been there a minute ago. Delia saw it and she understood, in that instant, that this man was fully capable of killing. But Boone Reyes was smarter than his anger. He'd run a chapter for 15 years. He knew the difference between winning tonight and winning for good. He knew what a courtroom did with dead bodies, and what it did with a drunk man holding a gun in front of 40 witnesses. "Put that away," he told his men low. "Nobody touches him. Nobody gives that man a single thing he can use in a courtroom." And to Marcus, loud and calm, "You want to call the cops, call them, please. Let's all wait right here for the cops." Because see, Boone had already thought 3 moves ahead. And Delia, standing there shaking between a drunk man with a pistol and 40 men who wanted to tear him apart, was about to find out that these men had brought more than muscle. The police did come. Marcus had called them himself, screaming about a gang and a kidnapping. 2 cruisers rolled up to find a strange scene. 40 bikers standing perfectly still and quiet, hands visible, breaking not a single law. And 1 drunk man in an expensive coat, waving a pistol around and screaming at the top of his lungs. Guess who got put in handcuffs first? But it went deeper than that. Because while Delia had been driving Colette across town, and while the club had been rolling out, Colette had done one more thing. On Delia's phone in that quiet corner of the kitchen, she'd taken pictures of her own throat, of her face, of the bruises up and down her arms, old and new. And she'd been keeping a record for months, hidden in a cloud account Marcus didn't know about. Photos going back half a year. A whole history of what that man had done to her, dated and saved. A smart, frightened woman building a case in the dark, waiting for a night she could finally use it. And there was more. Diesel, the old dog, had torn Marcus's leg open. Marcus's blood and skin were under that dog's claws and in his teeth. Right there at the scene, physical proof that he'd been in a violent struggle, and that a 13-year-old dog had been defending someone from him. When the paramedics checked Colette, they documented a crushed windpipe bruise in the shape of a man's hand. They documented a 6-month pregnant woman who'd been slammed against a wall. There was no story Marcus could tell that survived contact with that evidence. He kept talking anyway, louder and louder, and every word out of his mouth made it worse. The Prentice family lawyer showed up an hour later, and I want you to picture this. He arrived ready to make the Maid's life disappear, ready to bury one poor cleaning woman under a mountain of money and paper. That was the whole plan. Find the weak one, break her, make her the story. And instead he walked into a floodlit street to find his client in handcuffs, 40 witnesses with their phones out, a folder of medical photographs, and a chapter president who looked at him and said, very calmly, "You want to make this quiet? Then it goes away my way. She keeps the baby. She keeps everything. He signs it all over and he never comes near either of them again. Or we do it loud. Your choice, counselor." Lawyer looked around that street. He looked at the phones, he looked at the photographs, he did the math, and he chose quiet. Marcus Prentice was charged that night. Domestic violence, assault on a pregnant woman, brandishing a firearm. The photographs did the rest. The Prentice family, terrified of the scandal, cut him loose completely rather than have their name dragged through it. He didn't go to prison for as long as he should have. Men like that never do, but he lost everything that mattered to him. The money, the name, the wife, the child he'd tried to hurt before it was even born. Colette filed for divorce from a hospital bed and won every single thing. And Delia stood in the middle of all of it, this tiny woman in a bathrobe, watching a world she thought she understood get turned completely upside down. The rich family that could have crushed her, running scared. The dangerous men she'd feared, standing between her and harm like a wall. She'd spent her whole life being the person nobody protected. And in one single night she'd become the person 40 men would burn the world down for. She kept saying, "I didn't do anything. I just didn't walk by." And every time she said it, Boone shook his head, because to him it was everything. Colette delivered a healthy baby girl 7 weeks later. She named her Delia. Now let me tell you how it settled, because that's the part I love most. The maid didn't go back to the boarding house. She never scrubbed another prentice floor as long as she lived. She didn't have to. The club took care of that, but not the way you might think. They didn't just hand her money and ride off. That's not what any of it was about. Boone Rays owned a couple of legitimate businesses, a bike shop, a little diner off the highway that his guys ran, and he offered Delia a job running the front of the diner. Real work, real wages, her name on a paycheck instead of scrubbing somebody else's tile in the dark. She took it. She was good at it, too. Turns out a woman who spent 30 years being invisible sees everything. She knew every regular's order. She remembered every birthday. That little diner became the warmest place on that whole stretch of road. The men came in every morning. Big, scarred, tattooed men who scared half of Sacramento, sitting at the counter calling her ma'am and eating her cooking and checking that her car started in the winter. If her rent went up, it got handled before she even knew there was a problem. When her old sedan finally died, she came out one morning to a used but solid little car sitting in her spot with a bow on it and no note, because none of them would admit to it. She moved out of the 2-room apartment, not to a mansion. Delia didn't want a mansion, just a small, clean house with a yard close enough to the diner to walk. And here's the thing about that yard. It was for the dog, because Diesel came to live with Delia. Colette wanted the baby to have a fresh start, a soft, normal life, and that old dog was getting close to the end of his days. But he'd earned his rest, and everybody agreed there was exactly one place on earth he belonged, with the woman he'd fought beside. So Diesel spent his last 2 years in Delia's little yard, sleeping in the sun, getting spoiled rotten by 40 of the most dangerous men in California, who all somehow found reasons to stop by and scratch an old dog behind the ears. When Diesel finally passed in his sleep in the sun, an old man in leather with a gray beard sat on Delia's back step and cried like a child. And Delia sat next to him and held his hand, the same way he'd held hers that night in the rain. Colette healed. She raised her daughter with her brother back in her life, the family she'd tried to run from turning out to be the family that saved her. Little Delia grew up with 40 uncles and one gray tant who wasn't blood but might as well have been. The girl's first steps were taken across the floor of that diner, from Boone's hands into Delia's. And Delia Vasquez, who had spent her whole life certain that a woman like her didn't get to matter, spent the rest of hers surrounded by people who would have died to prove her wrong. She used to tell the story, near the end, to anybody who'd sit at her counter long enough. And she always told it the same way. She'd say she wasn't brave. She'd say she was just a maid who couldn't walk past a hurting woman one more time. She'd say the bravest thing she ever did took about 4 seconds, a fireplace poker and an old dog with nothing left to give but everything he had. And then she'd smile, and she'd top off your coffee, and she'd say the thing she'd learned that rainy night, the only piece of wisdom she ever claimed. She'd say, "You never know which small thing you do is going to be the thing that saves a life. So when the moment comes, and it will come, don't walk by. Remember that little woman with the taped-up hands." She set down her bucket, she picked up a poker, and she found out that the smallest person in the room can be the one who changes everything. Don't walk by. That's the whole story. That's all of it.